3. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And tonight we welcome back to the program Ann Garrison, an independent journalist and contributor to Black Agenda Reports, news commentary and analysis from a Black left perspective. And she's the host of her own program on Pacifica Radio. It's a California local branch. And we're going to be discussing...
Correction. It's actually, I work on a show. It's a cooperative show, and it is actually national. It's shown on stations across the U.S.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that correction.
Okay.
And and we'll be discussing recent big news in Africa, in Ethiopia, and Congo DRC. So first off, Ann, thanks for coming back on the program. It's an honor to have you back on.
Thank you. Honored to be on. It's always fun. You're so much fun.
Likewise. And yeah, let's get into it before Zoom kicks us out.
Okay.
So, and my first question is, can you explain to our audience what the recent conflicts between Ethiopia, between the government there in the region of Tigray and separatist rebels there? Just give us, if it's even possible, a brief overview before I get to my second question about recent peace talks that have come about between the two factions.
Okay. The secessionist rebels, actually ruled the country for 27 years, from 1991 to 2018. They used a multi-ethnic facade, but they were actually a dictatorship. And at one point in 2015, they claimed to have won an election by 100%. And Susan Rice permanently alienated much of the Ethiopian community by laughing about that and saying that she believed in it 100%. They ruled from 1991 to 2018, when they were forced from power by popular uprising. They retreated to Tigray, one of the regional states in Ethiopia. And then in November 2020, they launched a war by attacking the Ethiopian army, which they were part of. They attacked in the dark of night. They attacked soldiers in their beds. They killed many. The government responded as any government would by sending the Ethiopian army into Tigray. They managed to reclaim control of Tigray for several months, but then the TPLF came back stronger, drove them out of Tigray, and after a brief ceasefire, attacked the neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. And that war continued until there was a ceasefire around the spring of 2021. This is just before I was there myself. I was there during the ceasefire, and then resumed the war in August of last year. The Ethiopian army was victorious on the battlefield at the beginning of November. They went to Pretoria to negotiate an agreement. Mike Hamer, the current UN envoy to the UN special envoy to the Horn of Africa, flew from Tigray to Pretoria with the TPLF leaders in tow. So making it quite clear who their dog in the fight was from the very beginning. That had been clear for 2 years. The TPLF, when it was in power, were U.S. puppets. They took care of the U.S. agenda in Africa, and the U.S. didn't care what they did to their own people so long as they made their army available for their various projects, which included invading Somalia in 2006.
Okay.
Okay, this is a starter.
Continue. Go ahead.
Okay, good start. Okay.
Yeah.
You wanted me to continue? Oh, okay, they invaded Somalia. They overthrew the Islamic courts. The Islamic courts had brought some stability to Somalia after many years of war. They were not Islamic fanatics, although there were religious elements to their government. The U.S. didn't like them, sent the TPLF in to overthrow that government, and Somalia has been in chaos ever since. That's an example, maybe the most egregious example of the U.S. using the Ethiopian army when it was under the control of the TPLF to pursue its agenda in Africa. They had a relationship. Well, AFRICOM has a relationship with every African nation on the continent except Eritrea and Zimbabwe. And
Interesting.
I believe that AFRICOM has moved to Somalia. This is something I'm not positive about, but the main point is that the U.S. used the TPLF. It was their puppet for 27 years. They were very upset about seeing it removed from power. They lent political, diplomatic, and narrative support to the TPLF throughout this 2-year war that may have just ended, that we're all hoping has just ended. The implementation of the peace agreement is dicey, but they may even have lent other support, say material, logistical, intelligence support. That seems likely, but no one has hard proof of that. But they did support the TPLF in every other way throughout this war. Let's see, what else would you like to know about the oh, here's one other thing I could tell you.
Go ahead.
At first, their goals seemed to be to reclaim power in Addis Ababa, the capital. They were marching on Addis Ababa, and the U.S. was warning its citizens to leave the city. At that point, Abiy Ahmed, the president, went to the front himself to rally troops, and in one way or another, they were able to turn the TPLF back. They retreated to Tigray. Since then, since it became obvious that it would not be possible for them to resume power, to seize power and rule Ethiopia again from Addis Ababa, they seem to turn their goals to secession. And
Good.
The Constitution, perfect. My phone's ringing. Yeah, to secession, and there's disputed territory. When they were in power, they redrew the boundaries of the country, the regional states, and they turned them all, most all of them, into ethnically defined states. That hadn't been the case before, but they turned them into ethnically defined states, caused terrible ethnic strife, which continues, and they redrew the boundaries so that they gave themselves an area that they call Western Tigray. But the Amhara people believe that that is traditionally, historically, where they lived, and that the TPLF committed ethnic cleansing. I hate to use the word genocide, but that's the word used, that they tried to eliminate the presence of the Amhara in Tigray, and so this continues,
which is funny because those who have because the TPLF and their supporters in Western corporate state media and others on the left and then other left-leaning outlets, it's presented that the TPLF, that they're a wonderful people power organization, and that's the Ethiopian government, the current Ethiopian government, that's doing genocide and ethnic cleansing. There
are counterclaims of genocide being advanced by multiple ethnic groups. That's maybe another subject, but there is this competition for this area that the TPLF call Western Tigray, and the Amhara people call Wolkite. There are a number of cities there that are contested, but the shorthand for it has come to be Walkite, which is one of the major cities there. That the competition for that territory is something that's going to have to be settled one way or another for there to be peace in the region. Right now, it is under the control of the Amhara administration. It was taken by Amhara forces during the war, and the constitution says that it's part of Tigray. When Abiy Ahmed spoke to the parliament about the peace agreement that had been made, he said that was not the resolution of that land dispute was not in the agreement, that it would have to be settled constitutionally and within Amhara, amongst the people who live in that region. And I agree. Somehow they're going to have to work this out. There are means within the Constitution for holding some sort of referendum about this.
Interesting. And so talk to us about peace talks that have come about between the warring factions. What are the most important parts of this peace agreement that folks should pay attention to? And then any hopes of a united Ethiopia, hopefully living happily ever after? And if not, what should anti-imperialist activists be focusing to make sure that the U.S. and its allies don't make any more trouble in Ethiopia between Ethiopia and this region that the TPLF claims they have widespread popular supports?
Well, the part of the agreement that is dicey now, that will determine whether it's successful, at least in the short term, is disarmament. There are provisions about disarmament, and they say that the TPLF is supposed to disarm within 30 days. There's a schedule for disarming with light weapons, and then a schedule for disarming with heavy weapons, and it's all supposed to happen within 30 days.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the spokesperson for the TPLF, Getachew Reda, went on the BBC speaking to Stephen Shakur yesterday and said it could take months or a year. This just really upset everyone with hopes for this, because the peace agreement says it's supposed to be accomplished within 30 days. One of the controversial parts of it is that it says that all foreign and non-ENDF, that means non-Ethiopian forces, have to leave Tigray.
Okay.
That's complicated in several ways, because one, what is Tigray? Is it the boundaries of the region that was defined when the TPLF was in power, which is now under Amhara control? Or is it the previous Tigray, which is where the TPLF have been since they were driven back into that region? And who are foreign forces? The big sticking point, especially with the West, as I wrote in the piece I wrote for Black Agenda Report this week, is Eritrea. Eritrea neighbors Ethiopia, and under the TPLF government, Ethiopia was at war with Eritrea over territory on the border for many years. I mean, 2 years formally, but really for far many more. And there's a claim, there's a widespread claim that Eritrean forces are in Ethiopia. There is, and the TPLF did launch missiles at Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, at the beginning of the war. There's no hard evidence that Eritrean troops are there now, but the TPLF insists that they are, and insists that they will not honor the peace agreement until Eritrean troops leave. Well, if they keep claiming that Eritrean troops are there, there's no hard evidence. But they can conceivably keep claiming that and therefore claim that they refuse to disarm. There's also the claim about ENDF forces. That's the National Army. There are regional militias. One is sort of like the Amhara National Guard, and another is an ethnic militia called Fano. Okay, I'm trying not to let this get too complicated, but okay, there are some regional forces who've also been in Tigray fighting with the ENDF, and so that's another matter of contention.
Interesting.
And again, like I said, yeah, okay, but so the real fear for people hoping that this will work now is that the TPLF will refuse to disarm, that possibly they have some elements of the army that are refusing to accept the peace and may start a guerrilla war or something like that again. And the TPLF is claiming, they're acting like they won the war. They keep saying now, even though they signed this peace agreement, no, we won't do this, we won't do that until all our conditions are met. But they lost the war, and they did sign this agreement. So that's the real sticking point at this point at this time. And when the U.S. Foreign policy establishment speaks to it, whether it's Biden or Blinken or Ned Price, they emphasize foreign forces, by which we know they're talking about Eritrean forces. And the U.S. seems like it would be willing to accept the Ethiopian army's defeat of the TPLF if it could just drive a wedge between Ethiopia and Eritrea. There are a lot of reasons. The West thoroughly hates Eritrea. If you read anything about Eritrea, anything good in the past 2 years, I probably wrote it. And I went to Eritrea. Do you want to talk about that? Do you want to talk about Eritrea and that?
We can talk about that and how that's
okay. You had another question. I don't want to just rattle on without letting you tell me what it is you want to talk about, but I think this is absolutely this may be the most important thing to understand about this right now.
Sure.
Ethiopia has very egalitarian principles. When I went there, my first impression was that it had such an egalitarian atmosphere. There were no grotesque displays of income disparity and income and wealth disparity. And they have a charter which says that eliminating gross disparities in wealth and opportunity is that's one of their principles. And I found that to be true. I met, ministers working in modest offices, often driving beat up cars, who were obviously not using their positions to aggrandize themselves. And when I say I didn't see any gross disparities of wealth, that's not the kind of thing that you can hide. You can't say, "Oh, Ann Garrison's coming to Eritrea. We've got to hide the mansions. We've got to hide the presidential palace." I saw, a government that was truly committed. I talked to various officials, doctors, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Agriculture, some scientists, and everyone seemed truly committed to developing the country in a way that would uplift the entire population. So of course the U.S. can't stand that. And the other thing is that Eritrea controls its own security forces. It is, as I said, one of the two countries that has refused to sign a cooperative agreement with AFRICOM. As Glenn Ford said, AFRICOM got Africa to colonize itself by arranging all these cooperative security arrangements. And
that's why
yeah,
that's why the U.S. Is supporting secessionist forces
right.
in Ethiopia with the TPLF.
Yeah, well, the TPLF is extremely hostile to Eritrea, and for a number of reasons. The TPLF was really fighting an expansionist war. Its expansion into this area called Western Tigray was part of that, and it had a vision of Tigray that included parts of Eritrea. Let's see what else can I I wanted to say that the security forces, I said that the U.S. resents that it controls its own security forces and it has refused to become a partner of AFRICOM. Just an example of how important this is that Somalia, which neighbors Eritrea, has there's an arms embargo on Somalia, and there are U.S. troops in Somalia, and there are U.S. and European Navy swarming all over the coast of Somalia. I mean, there are all kinds of foreign bases in Djibouti, sort of holding on to their footprint, flexing their muscles in Africa. But there's for decades, it's been well documented that Europe is dumping toxic waste, including even nuclear waste, off the coast of Somalia.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to control this, they would have to have a sovereign nation with its own navy and its own coast guard. Instead, they've got all kinds of EU forces swarming off its coast, and there was an agreement signed. I can't remember the year, but there was an agreement to this EU forces patrolling the Somali and Indian Ocean coast that was the coast of Somalia border the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and Gulf of Oman. All of the strategic waterways there lead into the Indian Ocean. So there was this agreement signed somehow between the previous president of Somalia, who is now the president of Somalia again, that these EU forces would patrol that coast, and they don't care that Europe is dumping toxic and even nuclear waste on the coast of Somalia. Another absurdity of that story is that billions of dollars worth of fish are being stolen off that coast as well. And you would think that there might be some concern about eating fish that was harvested in waters where Europe is dumping toxic and nuclear waste. But these are two concerns: the fish looters and the toxic waste dumpers. They're not talking to one another, and they both have their short-term profits in mind. So whoever's eating this fish doesn't know. I mean, how do you know? How do you ever know where your fish came from? The fish on your plate. But to get back to the issue of Eritrea and controlling its security forces, that's an example of how important it is. The previous president, who was removed from office, there were a lot of U.S. manipulations. They didn't like him. He's out of office. He's been out of office since the spring, and he was trying to reassert control of the nation's security forces. And
having better relations with Ethiopia.
Yeah. In fact, okay, I think this is a lot of the motivation of this whole conflict, just tragic conflict, in which, okay, we're running out of motivation of this whole tragic conflict, is that Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia had formed a regional cooperation agreement, including trade and security. And the U.S. couldn't stand this. This was too much independence being asserted in the Horn of Africa. They said many times during this conflict that, and Samantha Power said this at the very beginning, that Ethiopia had been an anchor state. They called it an anchor state of stability. What that meant was that it was an anchor state for the projection of U.S. power on the continent. Okay. Now they've managed to eliminate, for now, he's very popular. Farmajo, the former president of Somalia, the last one who was eliminated in the spring, he's hugely popular among people there. So I don't think we've seen the last of him, but they've managed to knock out one of the leaders who signed this tripartite agreement. Now they're going after Eritrea. And if they could get Ethiopia to separate, to end its cooperative relationship with Eritrea, then they would be willing, I think, to live with Ethiopia.
Well, let's hope then. Let's hope cooler heads prevail then when it comes to this peace agreement, and then that means peace activists need to be very vigilant and they have to keep an eye on what the U.S. is doing, because I think that's what's going to be very critical. Then,
let me say quickly about what activists can do. Now we're talking about, U.S. activists. I'm talking about U.S. activists, but they're really punishing sanctions imposed on both Eritrea and Ethiopia. The sanctions imposed on Eritrea are among the worst in the world. They are one of the 4 nations that are unable to use the SWIFT system for completing international financial transactions. And those 4 are Eritrea, North Korea, Iran, and Russia.
Wow.
Yeah. And there's a fanatic, Michael Rubin at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a rabid neocon who is demanding that Eritrea be added to the list of state sponsors of terrorism. There are 4 on that list. I think they're Cuba, Iran, Syria, and North Korea. Yeah, all the bad guys. Yeah, and they're talking about adding Russia. And in Ethiopia, they canceled the preferential trade status that Ethiopia had that was encouraging its industry, its light manufacturing. They had anyone manufacturing in Ethiopia had the right to import to the U.S. tariff-free, and the end of that preferential trade status has been punishing, and punishing the people. Sanctions punish people, not governments, in the hope that people will become so miserable that they'll overthrow the government.
So activists need to be very vigilant.
Need to be opposed. Yeah, there's a House bill, HR 6600, and a Senate bill 3199, and these bills are still on the table. And when he talks about the peace talks and how do we feel about this and the outcome, the Biden administration still says, okay, we're going to keep these at the ready as weapons. No, we're not going to lift them, and we'll keep the possibility of further sanctions at the ready to use as political tools.
Unbelievable. And while I still have you on,
okay.
Now, 2 weeks ago, the Congolese government said it was going to send its military to the east, the Kivu region, to kick out Rwanda, its proxies, and their allies out of eastern Congo. What are your sources saying in Congo? And do you think the U.S. do you think that the government of Congo will go through with this threat? And if so, what can we expect the U.S., Canada, Belgium, and their allies to do?
Well, I think maybe the best way to answer that would be with regard to the different attitudes about the possibility that Eritrean troops are in Ethiopia. I mean, if they are in Ethiopia, then they have the sovereign, Ethiopia and Eritrea have the sovereign right to collaborate. Now, it's different. Rwanda being in DRC in Congo, that's an invasion. It's an invasion that's been going on for 26 years. Okay? But the U.S. doesn't make demands about DRC's sovereignty. It keeps demanding that Eritrea get out, that this is a violation of Ethiopia's sovereignty. But Ethiopia is not making any demands on Eritrea, and they have the sovereign right to cooperate. No one in the international community means the foreign policy establishments of the U.S.
Of North America.
The West, putting shortly, the West led by the U.S. and NATO. They're not complaining about Congolese sovereignty. They're talking about negotiations and this occupation, the Rwandan occupation of Congo has been going on for, like I said, 26 years. 26 years, and global corporations have profited enormously, as have the Rwandan and Ugandan governments. They're both occupying Congo. Rwanda is just in the lead. Rwanda is the lead and the most aggressive partner. There have been UN group of experts reports on Congo that have said that this militia, M23, is commanded from the top of the army in Rwanda and officials in Uganda, but Rwanda's, like I said, is always in the lead, that they cross the border to meet with M23. They recruit in Rwanda. They supply M23. Excuse me. This has come out.
M23 is basically a Rwandan proxy force.
It's a Rwandan militia. It is part of the Rwandan army that's calling itself M23 in Congo and pretending to be Congolese. But one thing that's exasperating is the way that the Western media keeps repeating this garbage about how they're alleged to be Rwandan. They're alleged to be Rwandan, and the Rwandan government denies. Well, of course the Rwandan government's denying it. What these reporters need to say is that the UN group of experts reports in 2010, and then again this year after M23 re-emerged, these reports say that this is a Rwandan militia commanded from within Rwanda.
Unbelievable.
And also Rwanda gets away with what it gets away with by using the genocide excuse. It's always saying, we've been victims of genocide. We have the right to go into Congo because there are people there who committed the genocide, 28 years ago. And like the TPLF, they trade on this claim that they're victims of genocide. And the West has tolerated this for years and years as part of the politics of genocide that Ed Herman wrote about in a book of that name.
Exactly. And so do you think that that Congo will finally go through with these threats that they're going to go into the eastern part of Congo to kick out Rwanda? And what are your sources in Congo saying about that?
Well, now we go back to the security services. I mean, Congo doesn't have a strong state and doesn't have a strong army. So there have been times when the actual Congolese will was not clear, because it seemed that they were collaborating in the looting and sort of making a show of not doing so. But whether the will is there or not, it's a weak state with weak security forces. So, and Rwanda is a very strong authoritarian state with very well-trained, well-developed security forces. In fact, Rwanda lends its army to various colonial purposes all over the continent, basically as mercenaries. They went into Mozambique to protect Total Energies' oil complex there in Mozambique, and then the French president gave $500 million worth of aid to Rwanda, and this is going on all over the continent. It was the motivation was explained very frankly in Foreign Policy this week. Someone wrote an article saying, the West doesn't want to trip over neo-colonial accusations, and so we'll let Rwanda do its business.
Unbelievable. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. This is part 2 of my discussion with Ann Garrison on recent events in Ethiopia and recent events in Congo. So, Ann, just before Zoom kicked us out, you were making a very interesting. You are making a very interesting point, comparing and contrasting what the West is doing, their attitudes towards Ethiopia and Congo. Please continue on with what you were. Continue on with what you were saying, or start from the beginning as you were talking about.
Okay. Well, as I told you, driving a wedge between Ethiopia and Eritrea seems to be the principal U.S. foreign policy goal at this point. And I told you why, all the reasons why the U.S. hates Eritrea. It's an egalitarian society. It's also one thing I didn't mention is that it is determined to get a fair price for its natural resources.
You're talking about Eritrea.
Eritrea, yeah, has been demanding a fair price for it. Another reason why the West hates Eritrea. It's an egalitarian, some might say socialist government. It refuses to cooperate with AFRICOM, and it's also demanding a fair price for its natural resources. This is something I didn't mention earlier. It has a 50-50 deal with its Bisha gold mine, which is unprecedented. Usually African countries get something like, there's a promise of 5%, and then they don't even get that. And the corporations extracting resources lie about how much they're taking out. One of the worst examples is Chad, which has nothing to show for the ExxonMobil pipeline, except a lot of pollution. But the same thing is true in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So there's the sovereignty issue.
Yes.
The claim that was why the U.S. and the rest of the West hate Eritrea. I mean, the oligarchs and corporate empires that control our governments. They keep complaining that Eritrea is in Ethiopia and that this is violating Ethiopian sovereignty. It is not, because Ethiopia and Eritrea have the sovereign rights to have a cooperative agreement. And every country in Africa, every single country except Eritrea and Zimbabwe, has a cooperative security agreement with AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command. So the whole idea that they can do this all over the continent, AFRICOM, and Eritrea and Ethiopia can't have a cooperative security arrangement, that it's just absurd.
And it's interesting, and it's interesting because you were saying that because first of all, it's the West and its proxy forces which are violating both Ethiopia and Eritrea's sovereignty, and the wedge that they're trying to and the divide and conquer that they're trying to do with Ethiopia and trying to have peace with with the region of Tigray. That's the West violating Ethiopia's sovereignty, and you were mentioning how both the Tigrayan People's Liberation Forces or the TPLF and Rwanda have both cynically used. You mentioned that fantastic book, The Politics of Genocide. They both have cynically used the G word to advance more reactionary politics and actually advancing their imperialist backers, which is the U.S., Canada, NATO members, EU members, and whatnot. So, yeah, and while the West claims that Ethiopia is violating its own sovereignty, Ethiopia is violating its own sovereignty.
Yeah, that's exactly that. Ethiopia is violating its own sovereignty. Exactly.
Yeah,
that's the way to put it.
They say nothing, though, about Rwanda violating the sovereignty of Congo. Rwanda and its proxies, Rwanda in conjunction with Uganda violating Congo's sovereignty. So, yeah, so talk about that, because you were mentioned. Talk about that before I get to my follow-up question.
Okay, yeah. The West keeps talking about how Congo and Rwanda should negotiate. There's no solution to this except to the problems in the eastern provinces, except for Rwanda to get out of Congo, stop violating its sovereignty.
Exactly.
And this is the sovereignty of nations is the first principle of international law, and it is expressed in the UN Charter. And this has been going on for 26 years, and also according to international law, the UN Security Council has the right to organize a multilateral force to stop it, but instead they've just organized these lame, hugely expensive, hugely corrupt peacekeeping operations, which have done nothing to solve the problem. So I don't know if I don't know if I would say that the U.S. is violating well, I think the sanctions are illegal, and they are a violation of Ethiopia's sovereignty and Eritrea's.
Mm-hmm.
That's most obviously.
But in Congo, you don't. So even though the Congolese government has threatened that they're going to send its troops to kick out Rwanda and all other and its Rwanda and its allies, but you don't think that that even if the Congolese government says that it wants to do it, you don't think that you don't think that they will go through with their threats because of
well, I don't.
Because
like I said, I don't think
describing because you were describing that Congo is a very weak state, and the West, mostly backs whatever Rwanda is doing. So, I'm curious more your thoughts on that.
Well, there was a real tragedy in 2013, the first time that M23 manifest in 2012. And then the Congolese army fought them, and a particularly competent and heroic commander emerged, Colonel Mamadou Ndala Mustafa, and known as Colonel Mamadou. And he led the Congolese army to drive M23 out of Rwanda. To drive them out of Congo and back into Rwanda and Uganda. And it was reported they had gone into Rwanda and Uganda to surrender. Well, that's like saying that the Confederate Army in the U.S. had gone south to surrender to Robert E. Lee. Then there were these sham peace negotiations funded by Warren Buffett, an oligarch. No, not Warren Buffett, his son, Howard Buffett. Warren Buffett's son, Howard Buffett, has huge resource interests in Africa. And he paid for these so-called peace talks. And the outcome was outrageous. It gave M23 everything they had wanted in the first place. What was this? And then Colonel Mamadou was assassinated about a month later. And,
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So for that to happen, there had to be some kind of Congolese collaboration going on. Now, I don't know. I don't want to say this about Tshisekedi. I don't know. He's the president now. Most of the Congolese I know told me over and over that Kabila, the former president, was in fact a Rwandan, and that he was collaborating in this.
Yeah. Joseph Kabila, the son of Laurent Kabila, overthrow Mobutu with the backing of the West.
Right. Well, there was he was
assassinated, and then he was assassinated when he tried to get Rwanda out of his country.
Exactly.
And then his son Joseph, Kabila, and it's long been seen that he's just a puppet of Rwanda and of the U.S. and its allies.
Yeah, and that he was most definitely pursuing his own resource looting in his own country. Congo needs a strong state that really represents the people, and a strong military to defend itself against Rwanda. And if the UN Security Council were to be serious about implementing the UN Charter, international law in this region, they would organize a multilateral force to drive Rwanda out. Now, it's kind of complicated because they're militias pretending to be Congolese. But this has been established for many, many years. Now, I wanted to say something about, well, wait, before, with regard to the sovereignty thing, I should also say that Rwanda has, as I told you, been acting as a mercenary all over the continent, but they're doing this in, they're establishing cooperative relations with corrupt governments, which don't have their people's interests in at heart. But for now, they're agreements between two sovereign nations, and so they are legal. And again, you see the hypocrisy of this demand that Eritrea stop or Ethiopia stop collaborating with Eritrea, and that Eritrea is violating Ethiopia's sovereignty. It just couldn't be more hypocritical. But then the other thing I wanted to address was the similarity in the rationale and behavior of the TPLF and the RPF, that's the Rwandan Patriotic Front.
Yes.
Yeah, the TPLF first came to my attention when they were attending a conference in Rwanda, and it became apparent that they have very close relations. And at the outset of this war, Paul Kagame offered to intervene. He said he would send his army in to intervene to stop Tigray genocide. The claim that there was a genocide going on in Tigray appeared as soon as the initial attack on the Ethiopian army took place. But there's a similar fanaticism about the two groups. Like when I first started writing about Rwanda and Congo, they would come screaming at me on social media, you know, you're a genocide denier, and all kinds of other, we're going to get you. The same thing is true of the TPLF and their supporters, and they seem to think that all they have to do is scream genocide. It's a conversation stopper. I'm screaming that I'm the victim of genocide, and therefore it's a conversation stopper, and you're a denier. And they don't feel the need to in any way substantiate their claims. When I was in Ethiopia, when I was in Addis Ababa just before I left, I drove past the Rwandan embassy, and this was in June. And there'd been a genocide commemoration in April. That was the beginning of the 90 days of massacres at the end of the Rwandan Civil War. But here in June, there was still a huge banner hanging outside the Rwandan embassy that said commemoration of the 28th year, the 20th year commemoration of the Rwandan genocide. And that was just evidence of how much this government trades on its genocide narrative and the privilege that it claims as a result, and the privilege that the world has given it for so many years. Even in these cooperative security arrangements in other parts of Africa, they will claim that they're victims and that this is about stopping genocide and mass atrocities, and therefore they are particularly a particularly appropriate force to do that. But in 2010, I went to a conference at Sacramento State University, a conference on genocide. And there were many Rwandan representatives there. And Rwanda was one of the main things that they talked about. And near the end, in a breakout session that was devoted to Rwanda, I waited, I listened to everything. And at the end, I asked, well, what about the 1994 Garrison report? This is a report that said the RPF was massacring Hutus, and both in Rwanda and in Congo. What about the 2000 Garrison report, the report of the panel of experts on the illegal exploitation of natural resources and other forms of wealth in DR Congo, 2001, 2003, 2004, and the 2010 UN mapping report about the Rwandan army committing atrocities that might be charged as genocide in an international criminal court. That was 2010. So the further reports, 2014, and the most recent one that said Rwanda was commanding M23, this was 2010. So that was the list of reports at the time. I said, what about these reports?
Yeah.
And they suddenly just started trying to shut me up, really aggressive. Just don't. You don't have any right. How dare you? How dare you? And by the time this was over, a bunch of the Rwandans, the representatives of the Rwandan government, had surrounded me screaming. It was really frightening. They had surrounded me screaming, oh, you're denying that my mother died. You're denying this and that atrocity. And one of them grabbed me by the arm. And at that point, I mean, imagine this, you get surrounded by people screaming and one of them grabs a hold of you. And someone from the university then intervened and said, hey, you can't do this here. And I went and filed an assault complaint with the campus police. When somebody grabs a hold of you, that's a definition of assault. And there was a similar incident when Sheldon Adelson and Shmuley Boteach were speaking with Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, at Cooper Union at a similar event. They were honoring Paul Kagame. Israel and Rwanda support one another in this genocide narrative in claiming privilege to commit all sorts of crimes because they are the victims of genocide. So at this event,
interesting that you're the victims of genocide, so therefore that gives you carte blanche to commit genocide towards other people, which is what Rwanda has been doing. And I mean, Kagame is the real genocidaire, and of course Israel with its ethnic cleansing of Palestine and whatnot.
Yeah. And so there was someone who came to protest, and he stood up and shouted, how can you be talking about genocide? How can you be celebrating this president who is guilty of killing millions of people in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? Everyone knows. And of course, when you do something like that, you expect to be ejected. Okay, so I'm sure he knew they were going to come and usher him out. But they didn't just do that. There were Rwandan security forces there. They came and grabbed him, and they didn't just grab him. They picked up and they slapped a hand over his mouth. I mean, it really just like that. Shut up. And they have, they've tried to get. It's illegal. It's illegal to deny the standard narrative of the genocide in Rwanda. There's a legal codification. You go to prison, and
So anyone who digs deep, anyone in Rwanda that digs deep into the real truth about Paul Kagame, they go to jail.
They go to jail, or they don't have to dig if they're honest about their own experience. So, and they've gotten these laws. They've managed to get these laws passed. Well, I think only one in Europe. In Belgium, they managed to make it illegal to talk about anything but the genocide against the Tutsi. You can't even say Rwandan genocide. Now, I don't think the law is taken very seriously in Belgium, but somehow they managed to get this law passed. And in France, where there's a constant back and forth about the story of the genocide, in part because France organized a humanitarian corridor for Hutus to flee the advancing Tutsi army into DRC, and Rwanda's been blaming France ever since. And this goes back and forth, where they're always trying to make it a law to speak about anything but the genocide against the Tutsi in France. But the TPLF has the same attitude that all they have to do is scream at you. They'll scream genocide. You're a genocide denier. And I think that is all that they have to say.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And then, sort and then sort of in closing, so are we to expect then that Congo is not going to then go into that the Congolese military won't go into Eastern Congo to kick out the Rwandans?
No, I wouldn't assume that. I wouldn't assume that. I ask in 2013, this heroic military leader, Colonel Mamadou Ndala Mustafa, Colonel Mamadou, was able to drive M23 out of Eastern DRC. So there's a question about whether or not Congo has the military power to achieve this at this time, and how much Rwanda has come in with heavier weapons. Well, M23 is in possession of heavier weapons than it was ever in possession of before. Does Congo have the military capacity to do that? Two questions: do they have the will, and do they have the military capacity? I'm not sure. So
we'll be having to sort of hold our breath and just wait and see then.
Well, we also have to hold our breath and wait and see what comes of the peace agreement in Ethiopia. Let's hope that it holds, because it was a horrible war.
Yeah,
caused hundreds of thousands of lives probably, and the International Internal Displacement Monitoring Center said that the greatest numbers of IDPs, internally displaced persons, in 2021 were in Ethiopia. Usually Congo has the highest number, but in 2021 they said Ethiopia. So it's a horrible war, and let's hope this is really the end of it.
One can only hope. But then as for Congo, then do you it sounds to me as if the U.S., Canada, and so forth won't. So even if Congo does go in and tries to kick out Rwandan forces, can we expect that the U.S. and Canada will be backing Rwanda until the last Rwandese is kicked out, or what?
Well, nobody knows where they're getting these weapons, where M23 is getting all this heavy weaponry, but they have not insisted on the findings in the 2014 report and the most recent 2022 report, evidencing that M23 is a Rwandan militia commanded from within Rwanda. Because they're not asserting that. Instead, they're talking about negotiations between Rwanda and DRC. Then that in itself is not supporting Congo in the conflict. If they were supporting Congo in the conflict, they would say, look, there's abundant evidence, decades of evidence in all these UN reports, and including the one in 2022. And so Rwanda has to leave DRC. Instead, they're saying these two sides should negotiate. Congo should negotiate away its sovereignty.
And then in closing, what do you think the Congo Solidarity folks and the real Rwandan dissident groups and their allies, what do you think them, as well as the broader anti-imperialist movement, what should be their reaction into both what's happening in Ethiopia and in Congo right now?
Well, with regard to Ethiopia, there's something very specific to do, which is to oppose these sanctions. And the Ethiopian and Eritrean voters are very well organized. They're the most the best organized diaspora communities I've ever seen. They were very active in this election. They have some friends in Congress. What the rest of us can do is try to oppose the passage of these two bills in the House and Senate that would impose, I mean, really, really draconian sanctions, including control of social media.
Wow. Okay.
One of these bills says that they would sanction. Well, one of them says that the state. This is 6600. I think the state would work with the social media giants to control the media narrative, to control the social media narrative about Ethiopia, and control disinformation, disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech, the new axis of evil. And the other one said 3199, that's the Senate bill, says that they would actually sanction anyone sharing disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech about Ethiopia, including the diaspora. And they just demand Ethiopia's complete surrender of its sovereignty to the U.S. That's what these bills say. That its army has to stop all offensive operations. Its army just has to stop fighting. That's what's in these bills. It has to stop defending the country and its sovereignty. So we need to organize against these bills and try to have the sanctions that have already been passed lifted. With regard to DRC, I think the main thing that most of us can do is continue to try to spread awareness about what's really going on.
Exactly. Yes, and that also requires lots of people to. That also requires lots of people also to be speaking out on Rwanda and showing more and more suppressed information.
And speaking out for the Rwandan people. I think one thing we didn't talk much about is that the Rwandan government is hugely repressive, and the majority of the people are suffering under the Rwandan government as well.
Exactly, including including the hero of Hotel Rwanda, who was kidnapped by the Kagame government and is now in prison there because he's been speaking out against Kagame, right?
Oh, Paul Rusesabagina. Yeah, Paul Rusesabagina, exactly.
Well, I think that's a pretty good place to end it. And yes, and people need to join organizations like Black Alliance for Peace and whatever anti-war or anti-imperialist organization in whatever parts of the states and so forth. Also lobby those organizations to be speaking out more on what's going on in Africa with the spread of Africa. The spread of Africa.
Yeah. But I think you meant the Black Alliance for Peace. That's a really good idea. Joining the Black Alliance for Peace, and also Friends of the Congo. And I think if there are legislative issues that they want U.S. activists to lobby on, I think they'll let us know.
Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Ann Garrison of Black Agenda Reports. And I hope to have you back on in the future. We'll be monitoring the situation, so hope to have you back on again.
Okay.
And thank you so much.
Okay.
And again, always thank you so much for all of your insights and all your knowledge and all of the good work that you do.
Okay. I'll see you later, Youri. Bye-bye.